morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Bachin. I direct the Office of Civic and Community Engagement at the University of Miami, and we're thrilled to be partnering on this event with Neighborhood Housing Services, with whom we work on a number of projects. So I just want to say a few introductory words, and then I'll be introducing Arden Shank, who is the President and CEO of Neighborhood Housing Services, who will introduce our speaker, Alan Mallach. So we're delighted to have Alan Mallach here today for this talk, Miami by the Numbers, a look at neighborhood housing markets. Our office, and in particular, our program coordinator, Emily Eisenhower, has been working with Alan Mallach on a variety of housing indicators for Miami's markets. This is part of an initiative that we're about to launch in the next month, and you'll all be getting information about the official launch of a project called the Miami Affordability Project, or MAP. It's an online mapping and data visualization tool that has over 100 different filters for data related to affordable housing in Miami-Dade County. And so that is both where there is affordable housing and public housing, where there is cost burden, what the need is. This is overlaid with census data, and we're also doing a drill down on a number of neighborhoods, including Overtown, to look at historic sites and the ways in which those sites could be reused and promote economic growth and revitalization in communities. So this is some of the work that we've been doing in collaboration with Alan Mallach. We're very happy to be forging this partnership, and I'd just like to thank our sponsors for this event and for our mapping project, and that is JP Morgan Chase, as well as the Miami-Dade County Housing Finance Authority. So I would now like to introduce Arden Shank, President and CEO of Neighborhood Housing Services of South Florida, who will introduce our speaker.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I also welcome you to this space here. I happen to be a member of this church, and so this to me is a very familiar space, and I hope by the end of the morning that it is for you as well. The facilities, if you need, are through this door here to the left. We hope you feel comfortable here. There's coffee and other things at the back. Help yourself. This is a relatively small group, so feel comfortable just to get up when you need to. I am delighted to introduce Alan here in Miami again. Alan was here 3 or 4 years ago to do a presentation kind of generally in the same themes and framework as this, but all of us in the community development and community change field have been learning and growing in this business of how do we collect and analyze data related to neighborhoods that we work in and care about. And so the work that Robin and her colleagues have been doing helps move this along in terms of data in various neighborhoods. And Alan will make some comments about some neighborhoods here in Miami-Dade County. Alan is a senior fellow with the Center for Community Progress, which is a non-resident senior fellow, he's a non-resident senior fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He's had a number of other connections and engagements over the years, including the Federal Reserve in Philadelphia. He was involved in starting a community development organization in Newark many years ago, and you might hear some about that. Has worked with a number of cities, not only in New Jersey, but in other parts of the country to design programs of gathering and analyzing data. For those of you who this morning's conversation isn't enough, Alan has a number of books. I won't name them here because you won't remember what they are anyway, but you will be able to find them online, and if you can't, you can let me know, and I can get you the details of those titles and what those books are about in terms of community development, neighborhood revitalization, and data analysis. We were joking earlier about maybe there's a slight possibility we might be better served if we simply close our eyes and open our minds while Alan plays the piano rather than speaking. He is just as good at that as he is what he is going to do, but we decided to go ahead with this anyway, since that's what we invited you here for. So let's welcome Alan.
So, good morning. I have two prefatory comments. The first is, notwithstanding I'm basically a practitioner who got interested in data rather than a data person who looks at the practice side. I mean, very much my background is in actually trying to do this stuff, not just study it. The second point I'd like to make is I had no idea that there were so many hardcore data junkies in the Miami area. And I hope you'll find this rewarding, but it is going to be pretty data-y. So to begin, this is what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to start talking a little bit about an underlying issue, which is this basic idea of the market. Because I think one of the most fundamental things is that, and this is whether you like it or not, I'm not here to promote markets or argue against them. I'm here to suggest that they are kind of the fundamental underlying reality that drives most of what happens in neighborhoods and how it affects people. And markets are basically, they're all about consumer decisions, people making decisions about whether it makes sense to undertake a particular type of transaction, whether it's a landlord deciding whether to buy a house that he will rent out, somebody deciding which neighborhood to live in, somebody deciding whether to put money into their house or just let it ride. And these in turn all have to do with supply and demand, and the relationship between how the demand operates in an area and what the supply of that area is. Because basically, and this is pretty basic stuff, within a region there is a certain demand for all of the various things that any neighborhood can offer. And that's a demand for houses, a demand for amenities, a demand for quality of life, a demand whether it's schools, safety, transit, et cetera, et cetera. And each neighborhood has a different supply of those features. And it varies very widely. One area will have excellent transit and be very safe. Another area will have no transit, might be dangerous. Another area will have houses that are utterly gorgeous and everybody wants. Another second area will have houses that basically look like hell. Excuse me. And ultimately, it's the relationship between consumer choice and consumer decisions on the one hand, and the supply and demand relationship that drives, I won't say everything that happens in a neighborhood, but something like maybe 90%. And the reason I mention this, and I stress this, even though this might seem obvious, is that this is something that people who practice in the area of community development, who are working in neighborhoods, often overlook. And so it's important to keep this perspective. And so if you look at this, all of the kinds of things that you want to see happen in the neighborhood in terms of improvement are basically driven by the underlying supply and demand equation. And so, just by way of, these are sort of background principles. They're not the only factor, but they're the most important one. But the last two are critical. Nobody, no neighborhood, no community development organization, no local government is simply a slave to the market, no matter what some kind of right-wing economic fundamentalists might suggest. You can influence the market, you can move it, which is, of course, the role of neighborhood revitalization and community development strategies. But in order to do so, you need information. You cannot do it blind. So, what data can do, very briefly, and I will come back to these points, is it helps you understand what's happening in a neighborhood today, what the neighborhood is like today, how the neighborhood is competing, how the neighborhood is doing. It helps you understand the trends that are affecting that neighborhood, whether it's improving, declining, staying the same. And then, and this is where I'm going to finish in some detail, it can help you design the most appropriate strategies for changing the neighborhood in the direction where it wants to go. So, with that as background, I'm going to try to give an overview of some of the key factors that are going on in Miami-Dade based on the data that the university team has assembled. And then I'm going to zoom in on the area known as the 79th Street corridor and look at some of the particular factors working in that neighborhood. So, in contrast to a lot of the cities where I work, like Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, Miami-Dade is a growing community. It's been steadily growing. As you can see, during the period when the market collapsed and the recession hit, Miami-Dade had what you might, I think of as a kind of a growth hiccup. For a couple of years there, growth slowed down significantly. But as soon as the worst was over, it picked right back up again. Contrary to some of my planner friends who were really kind of hoping that this market collapse and recession would mean the end of the Sun Belt and force everybody to go back to the North and the Midwest. Not a chance. But, so it's a steadily growing area. But, now if you look at sales prices, which are a pretty fundamental index of how a community is doing, this is interesting. Two things. First is there's been a very significant recovery in the last couple of years in terms of prices. But it's nowhere near the peak back in 2006, 2007. The second point, which is also interesting, is that single-family houses fell less and have recovered more than condos. I mean, there's a huge disparity. Interestingly, as you can see, in 2008, condos, the average selling price for a condo was about 20% higher than that of a single-family house. Today, it's the opposite. They've flipped. So that's an important thing to look at. Now, in terms of the actual prices, this is also interesting, is because you can see is many areas, the basic distribution of prices hasn't changed significantly at all, despite the huge roller coaster that this county as a whole has gone through. The expensive areas 7-8 years ago are still the expensive areas. The inexpensive areas, the low-value areas, particularly in the south and the north, are still basically the same, except a couple of areas. And this, again, I don't know Miami-Dade well enough to describe exactly what this area is, but it's very interesting how this part of the county to the west, which has significantly lost ground relative to the rest of the county as the recession hit and then the recovery followed. That's the kind of thing where the data is really telling you, hey, here is something interesting we'd better look at. It doesn't tell you why or what, but it points to an issue that really calls for really drilling down and finding why has that area done so much worse in the process of the last 7 or 8 years than most of the rest of the county. So another important thing worth noticing is the number of houses and apartments that have been vacant for a year or longer has been pretty, with a couple of bumps, has been pretty steadily rising all the while. Now this is, again, another thing, the data doesn't say why, but the data says here is an issue. Is it because all of these houses have been bought by Venezuelan millionaires who are waiting for the moment to come to Miami, but are holding them empty? Not likely, because if you look at the concentrations, the concentrations of these houses are not in houses and apartments, are not in the upscale parts of the county. They're, again, in the north and the south. They're in areas, again, suggesting one of the things, and this is not unique to Miami, this is something you see all over the United States, and I think it's very important. If you look at national data or regional data on the whole, it generally shows a very significant recovery from the recession and the market collapse and the foreclosure and mortgage crisis. But if you drill down in almost any region of the United States, you will find that the recovery has actually been extremely uneven, and that the stronger areas before the bubble have recovered the best. The weaker areas before the bubble have recovered the least. And again, this is very much the case in Miami-Dade. Again, interestingly, tax delinquency has come down very significantly, but mortgages, foreclosures are still high. And again, if you go back and if you look at the map I showed you earlier, which showed the prices, and then you look at the distribution of foreclosures, you'll see that the greatest price collapse and the least recovery of prices is in the same areas which are still seeing the highest level of mortgage foreclosure. So, and this is, again, not unique to Miami-Dade, but it's a consistent pattern that foreclosures and price recovery, or the absence of price recovery, go hand in hand. And no surprise, these are the areas that still have by far the highest concentrations of negative equity, in the sense of homeowners who are still underwater in terms of the relationship of their house value to the amount of their mortgage. And then finally, one other point which I think is very important. One of the most important issues when you're looking at a community in a neighborhood housing market is who's buying. Are the buyers home buyers who are going to live in the houses, or are they investors? And that does not mean that investors are bad people. In fact, if you did some kind of a moral scale and took a bunch of investors and a bunch of home buyers, they'd probably come out pretty much the same. In fact, an awful lot of investors are home buyers and vice versa. But the reason this matters is that people make those decisions for very different reasons. An investor basically makes a decision, typically, on a very simple calculus. If I buy this house, can I make money? And there are a lot of different ways to make money from a house. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and some of them are kind of neutral. But it's purely, can I make money? If a home buyer buys a house, it's a much more complicated thing. It's, do I want to live in this neighborhood? Is this a place, because when you buy a house and move into a neighborhood, you're not just making a financial investment, which you are. And for most people, the largest single financial investment they're ever going to make in their lives. but you're also making a psychological investment, because you're going to have, and it doesn't matter whether you're the sort of person who goes out and joins a neighborhood association, or somebody who just sits on your front porch and makes nasty noises when the neighboring teenagers go by. You're going to be involved in some fashion in the geography where you've bought your house, and that's a psychological investment. So there's a huge difference in the significance of those two types of decision. And so now I'm hopeful, and this is something we'll be talking about with Robin and Emily over a thing, to be able to zoom in on this a little more precisely. But what we've done so far is looked at this by using a kind of a metric that I came up with, which is that we know statistically that home buyers, the overwhelming majority of home buyers, go out and get mortgages to buy their homes, probably around 80%. And those mortgages are recorded and show up in the data that's provided by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA. We also know that very few investors get mortgages. Some do, but on the average, I think it's less than 20%. So you can get a ballpark estimate of the mix of home buyers versus investors buying in any neighborhood by comparing the total number of sales to the total number of purchase mortgages made. So this is what we did, and what it shows, and again, if you look at what you might call the high rent district in the center, most sales come with mortgages, meaning that most of the people who buy in areas like Coral Gables are home buyers. If you look at the north in particular, as well as some other parts, but especially in the north, it's the opposite. And there are very few mortgages relative to sales. Again, telling me that these are areas where the great majority of buyers are investors and not home buyers. So this just gives you a sense of how looking at this data can help you understand sort of what's going on in the Miami-Dade area writ large. It doesn't give you the answers, it doesn't necessarily explain why, but it points you in the direction of which questions to ask and how to pin down the information. So, zooming from this rather big picture to a finer grain, the 79th Street corridor. Now, the area in red is not identical to the area that NHS of South Florida and others are actually working in. It's the area that is made up of the census tracts that cover it. So the actual area they're working in is somewhat smaller, because not the entirety of some of the census tracts are not in it, but it's a pretty close approximation. This makes up just another point I'll mention briefly, is that all of the data that we've been using so far is organized around census tracts, which is not perfect, but it is the standard unit that people organize data around. A census tract typically contains between 2,500 and 5,000 people. And in a large community like Miami-Dade, you can usually link your census tracts, say these census tracts are a pretty good equivalent of such and such a neighborhood. And this is something that hopefully at some point, as part of this project, we'll be able to start clustering census tracts and say, okay, here's the data for Overton, here's the data for Brownsville, here's the data for Little Haiti, and so forth, based on clusters of census tracts. So this is the 79th Street corridor. Well, what do we know about the center? Here are kind of a couple of images, typically, it looks like. It's a low-density area. The houses are modest. There's obviously one major shopping center, commercial cluster, the corner of 27th and 79th, and a couple of small commercial nodes elsewhere in the neighborhood. Now, we also know that it's a poor area, and there's two kind of classic indicators of social and economic condition. Even though Miami-Dade as a whole has a much higher poverty level than the nation. It's about 20% compared to the United States is about 14%. So as an entire county, it's a high poverty county, relatively speaking. But if you look at the 5 census tracts that we're looking at in the 79th Street area, the poverty rate is almost 35%, which is extremely high. And that is, again, this is an area of concentrated poverty. And as you can also see, the percentage of adults who have a college degree, which is a critically important factor today in terms of not only current economic condition, but economic potential, is extremely small. The county, interestingly, at 26% is pretty close to the national average, which is about 29%. But only 8%, roughly, of adults 25 or older in the 79th Street area have a college degree, which puts them, again, at a huge disadvantage in terms of today's marketplace for jobs. So looking at, though, when you zoom in, though, if you look at these 5 census tracts, there's some major differences. And the first, sort of, as you go, if I go back here, sort of, so this, the graph kind of goes from west to east. Oops, wrong way. And so as you can see, the western part of the area tends to be slightly more advantaged or less disadvantaged than the eastern part. Also, what's noticeable is that there's a huge difference in the homeownership rates between the eastern and the western parts of the area. But the differences are pretty significant. I mean, so for example, tract 902, which is this area, it's somewhat poorer than the county as a whole, but it's not that much worse off than the county average. And in fact, the homeownership rate is higher. But as you go east, when you get tract 1502, which is down here, is one of the, in fact, you find few, as you go around nationally, there are few areas, few places where poverty, unemployment, and so forth are so intensely concentrated. This is a, truly deeply distressed area where over half of all of the people who live in that tract are below the poverty level. So, again, this is important because even when you zoom in on a neighborhood, you can see there can be huge differences from one part of the neighborhood to the next, which again have to be taken into account when you start doing, planning or coming up with strategies. So a couple of other things. This, again, what's interesting here, and this goes back to the point I made about, when a county catches cold, the low-income neighborhoods get pneumonia. This compares, first in terms of numbers and then in terms of percentages, what's happened in the county as a whole in terms of change in house price and what's happened in the 79th Street area. So house prices in the county dropped by almost 50% and have gotten about half of that back. House prices in the 79th Street area dropped by 80% and have only gotten about less than a fifth of the loss back. So this is an example, again, how the low-income areas, the low house value areas were hit harder by the foreclosure crisis and the end of the housing bubble and have recovered less. And 79th Street area is a good example of that. So, but what's interesting, and this again, is while the number of sales dropped off very sharply at first after the bubble burst, the number of sales in the 79th Street area has actually bounced back pretty nicely. And it's up to close to where it was before the bubble burst. But if you look at the blue line, that's the number of mortgages that were made in the area. They have not rebounded, which tells me a couple of things. First is it's probably very difficult for home buyers, if there are any who want to buy houses in that area, to get mortgages. And secondly, that most of the people buying houses in that area are likely to be investors and not home buyers. That investors find it to be a good business proposition. Well, why is that? Okay, this is another thing that data can tell you. There's a concept that people use in the real estate industry. It's a very simple but very important idea. It's what they call the sales-rent ratio. And that is the ratio between the annual gross rent you can get for a house and how much it costs to buy the house. And basically, if you look, for example, what people in the industry think of as kind of the sweet spot is around a ratio of about 8 to 10, say. Now, at that ratio, you can get a very decent, you can maintain a property well and get a good 6 to 9% annual return on your property, on the investment you've made. As it gets lower, you can make more money. As it gets higher, you can make less. So one of the reasons, for example, that you do not find any investor, except for somebody who is completely irresponsible and irrational, buying a house to rent out in San Francisco. Why? The sales-rent ratio, the last time I looked, is pushing 40. That means you can't rent the house for enough to get a decent return on how much you have to pay to buy it. Conversely, a couple of years ago, when I looked at Detroit, the sales rate ratio was 2. That means that the annual rent, you could get the entire purchase price of your house back in 2 years. Now, strictly speaking, you can't get the whole thing back. I mean, you have to put some minimal amount of money into the house. But you can get it back in 3 years with a profit. Well, the reason this is important is it affects people's decisions about what kind of a landlord they are. Now, let's say you buy a house in Detroit for $15,000 that you can rent out for $750 a month. Now, or $9,000 a year. And those aren't crazy numbers. Well, they are, but they're real. Well, when you start thinking about it, hey, I don't know that this house is ever going to be worth more than this, and it might be worth less, but if I do the arithmetic, let's say I don't pay my property taxes, which are crazy high anyway. I provide minimal maintenance. I just try to get everything I can. I rent to anybody who shows up. I don't care what they are. And so I make $9,000 a year. If I don't pay my taxes and I provide only minimal maintenance, it's all net. So 9 times 3 is $27,000. I paid $15,000 for this house. And the county won't come after me for back taxes for a minimum of 3 years. So I got 3 years without even having to worry about the taxes. $27,000 on $15,000 after 3 years. That's a pretty good I've made my money. Let the county have the house. Now that is, so if the price gets too low, it essentially drives landlords, even people who might feel a little guilty about what they're doing, to behave irresponsibly, not in the interest of the neighborhood, because it is so profitable, so much more profitable to do so than to be a responsible landlord. When rents get high, when prices get higher though, the equation shifts. Let's say you pay $100,000 for a house and you can rent it for $1,000 a month. And you spend, between taxes and maintenance and everything else, you spend $400. That leaves a net of $600, $7,200 on an investment of $100,000. That's 7%. That's a decent return. But you're never going to make enough money that way to justify just saying, okay, I've made my pile, I'm going to walk away. If you're making 7% a year on that investment, you still, in order to make a good, solid, long-term business decision, you've got to hold on to that house and be able, down the road, to sell it, ideally at a profit, but at least for what you paid for it in the first place. Well, that means, in contrast to the first example, where you're motivated to not maintain it and you're motivated to not pay your property taxes and you figure let the county have it. In the second example, you're motivated to pay the property taxes. You don't want to lose the property. You want to be able to sell it. And you're motivated to maintain it because you don't want to sell it as a total wreck. You want to sell it as something somebody's going to want to buy. So what I'm saying, the ratio flips the decision-making process. So here, what's interesting here is the ratios in the 79th Street corridor aren't, with the possible exception of that one very poor tract where the house prices are really low, the ratios aren't low enough to make it a really good business decision to milk the property for a couple years and walk away. But they're in that borderline area between where it makes more sense to hold than to milk and walk. But they're closer to the hold, which means, and I'll get to that when we start talking about strategy, is this suggests that, in contrast, again, to my first example, this is an area where if there was an effective program to set standards for rental housing and landlords and enforce them, along providing incentives for responsible landlord behavior, you could see a significant improvement in the quality of the rental housing. Because the numbers are good enough so that a responsible landlord who provides a high level of maintenance can still make a good profit on a house in the 79th Street area. So that's another thing. Now, as I mentioned, there are some big differences, and this is, in one part of the area, you have a very high home ownership rate. In another part, it's very low. And when you look down, so you can start looking at some of the trends by census tract. One thing that's interesting is that the sales price trend is basically the same in the high home ownership and low home ownership areas, which is a little surprising. But the vacancy trend, on the other hand, is very different. And in fact, these are 902 and 903 are the areas with the highest home ownership. And they have by far the lowest and the most stable vacancy rates in the area. As you can see, the other areas are trending significantly upward and have very major vacancy problems. And then you see the same pattern with property tax delinquency. Again, these are the two high home ownership tracts. They're trending down faster, and they're much lower than the other tracts. So, but in all cases, property tax delinquency in the 79th Street area is significantly higher than in the county as a whole. So this again is kind of a snapshot of some of the things that the data tells us about that area. Yes, sir?
The 902, 903, those numbers, are those like the geographical locations?
Yeah, those are the numbers of the census tracts. And 902 and 903 are the census tracts that tend to be the ones with the highest home ownership and, relatively speaking, the lower poverty and unemployment, the ones to the west.
Then why would there be a higher tax delinquency in 902 and 903?
Lower.
Lower.
They're lower.
Okay, I see, yeah, yep.
The key is opposite
Yeah.
of lines.
Yeah.
I see.
So now, in what time I have left, I'm not sure, well, I have little, I'm going to talk about what do you do with this data. And it's one thing, it's again, so what does data, this is what I mentioned, what does data tell you? Data basically tells you two things. It tells you what you know already, and it tells you what you don't know. Both are useful. If it confirms what you know, it can help you zoom in on it more precisely. It's a lot more useful, in my opinion, to know the actual levels of tax delinquency than to be able to say, which you might be able to based on just knowing a neighborhood. God, a lot of people in this neighborhood aren't paying their taxes on time. It's better to know more precisely. But often enough, it tells you stuff you don't know. Because people, a lot of this stuff is kind of under the surface. And people who look at a neighborhood, you know, it's the classic old story of the blind man and the elephant. And each one looked at the elephant. They didn't look technically. Each one felt a different part of the elephant and said, oh, an elephant is like a hose pipe. Oh no, an elephant is like I forget what, like a pillar. Oh no. And people look at neighborhoods in the same way. And very few people have a complete picture of what's going on in a neighborhood. Now, one thing that is very important, though, is the data doesn't tell you everything. And the data often, and this is a problem with data, often lags behind change. So it's really important if you're working in a neighborhood and you're working on trying to foster change in the neighborhood to use the data as a starting point, but not the be-all and end-all. And one thing that I know some people do is put together like a kind of an ongoing focus group of people in a neighborhood who are knowledgeable. And this can be, you know, a number of residents who are active in the community and seem to be familiar with what's going on. It could be a local contractor or developer who does a lot of rehab or home improvement work. It could be a realtor. It could be even the person who delivers the mail. I don't know if they have beat cops in Miami-Dade, but if there is, it could be a police officer who's familiar with the neighborhood. And just bring them together on a regular basis to say, what's happening? What are the trends that you see? And use that to amplify the data. But the thing is, once you understand the conditions and the trajectories, then you can start thinking about how this can be used to figure out what you want to do in the neighborhood. Now, this starts with a basic principle. I'd like to believe this, that when you're working in a neighborhood, you're trying to achieve some goals, and you know what they are. Now, that's not always true, unfortunately, but I think it's a good approach to follow. It's a good idea to have some goals and then have some clear sense of how what you're doing is designed to meet those goals. And this is where the data becomes really important. So, for example, is one major goal that one might have in a particular neighborhood is to influence how property owners deal with their properties. It's basically to influence market decisions. I mean, that's probably one of the most fundamental goals you could have, because you're trying to change the basic pattern of market decision making in the neighborhood. In other words, you want homeowners to improve their all property owners, whether they're homeowners or investors, to make their property, to invest money in their properties to make them better. You want to get more homeowners to move into the neighborhood. You want to get more businesses to locate in vacant storefronts, et cetera, et cetera. This is all about motivating property owners, either current or prospective property owners, to make decisions differently from what they might have. Now, if that's the goal, then you have to know that there's enough market opportunity in that neighborhood to make it rational for people to do so. Because ultimately, and I don't subscribe to some of the sort of classic economic theories that all human beings are rational actors all the time. But I would say most human beings are at least semi-rational actors most of the time. People, if you're thinking about buying a house, I mean, first you want to make sure you can afford the house. But you want to make sure that house meets your needs as a family, and you want to ask yourself some questions. Is the house going to be worth more or less than it is today, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now? Now, you don't have the answer, but you look at a variety of things to get your best judgment of that. If you own a house and you're thinking of putting money into it, you're going to say, can I justify putting $30,000 or $50,000 in this house? Will it be worth that after I've done it? Or et cetera. If I'm thinking of being an investor, can I get enough rent to justify buying this property? If there's a house that needs a whole lot of work in a neighborhood, and this is a common situation where people may be buying houses that are in basically move-in condition, say $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. But let's say there's a house that really needs major work, and it's being offered for $40,000. If you look at it and you say, oh God, it's going to cost $60,000 to fix, and that means 40 plus 60 is 100, but that house is still only going to be worth 70. Now, there are a few people out there who just fall in love with a house. I know a couple of people who've put $250,000 into a house, a historic house in Allentown, Pennsylvania, that they'd be lucky to get 100 for. But they love the house, and they've done a beautiful job, and for the moment they live in it, and hope to for a while. But you can't build a neighborhood on the basis of crazy people. You have to build it on the basis of rational people. So the question is, how do you motivate the decisions? How do you manipulate the market? How do you change the dynamics of what's going on? And this is where the data can be very useful. Now I'm going to show a couple of examples from a project I recently finished in Trenton to illustrate a couple of points. The first thing we did is we took a lot of these data sets and created a typology of the different neighborhoods in the city. Trenton's a much smaller place than Miami-Dade. It's about 90,000 people, 7.5 square miles. But as you can see, even within that very small area, there's huge variations. The second thing we did is we then looked at, now I realize this slide is totally incomprehensible, but I'm going to explain it. Is we took the neighborhoods. Okay, Trenton has a certain number of very strong neighborhoods where basically they're doing okay. But then there are a whole cluster, a much larger number of neighborhoods that you might call them semi-strong. They're doing pretty well, but dot, dot, dot. So we then zoomed in and said, okay, what are the buts? And so here are the neighborhoods, and here are the buts. And this indicates how much worse relative to the neighborhood's quality as a whole each one is. So 3, slightly worse, 4, more worse, 5, worstest. So you look at, for example, the island. The island's very strong, it's a lovely neighborhood, it's on the river, nice houses. It floods every couple of years, but so what are the problems there? There's not vacancies, no vacancies to speak of, crime is low, tax delinquency is low, foreclosures are low. But what you're seeing there is a huge trend in investor buying, absentee investor buying, a low home ownership rate, a slipping home ownership rate, and low house prices. If you compare that to, let's say, look at this section of Chambersburg. High foreclosures, again, a lot of investors, a lot of low sales price, but also a lot of crime. This area has a lot of vacant houses. So now, okay, this is more than just interesting. This can be very significant in terms of when you start to think about how do you stabilize. These are basically areas that are reasonably strong but at risk. And the question is, how do you stabilize them? Well, if you look at the island, for example, then what this tells you is this neighborhood is basically a pretty good neighborhood. But it has what you might call an external problem. People are not buying in that neighborhood. They may not know enough about it. They may not know that it's a really great neighborhood. And the people who are buying are investors, and the prices are low. So what your strategy in that case might be a matter of trying to market the neighborhood, trying to promote home ownership, trying to get more people to think about what a great neighborhood this is, I want to come and live there, and so forth. It's an external strategy. But if you look at some of these other neighborhoods where the crux of the problem are vacant properties, crime, and so forth, that's an internal problem. As a salesperson might say, you don't have a problem with marketing, you've got a problem with your product. And so that means that you, instead of just focusing on the marketing side, you've got to fix the product or the problem. Because ultimately, if you try to market something where the product doesn't fit what you're trying to do, it's not going to work. And so what this can do, and again, data, it can help you zoom in, not just on the fact that these neighborhoods are at risk, but what are the specific factors that are making them at risk, so that you can then say, what are the strategies that are most likely to be successful in terms of trying to change those neighborhoods. So a lot of the questions, and I won't go into this in detail because I'm pretty much out of time, these are some of the questions that you can start using your data to try to zoom in on. So which areas are you most likely to be able to increase home ownership through marketing and home buyer incentives? Where does it make more sense to demolish a vacant house versus rehabilitate it? Where and how do you focus on raising the bar for landlords, which I think is particularly important in areas where you've seen large increases in investment activity? Again, as I mentioned, when should you be focusing on an external strategy, a marketing, an incentive approach, versus strengthening the social and economic fabric of the neighborhood from the inside first? And where do you target scarce public resources? And I'd like to finish, though, with a real hardcore concern. All of the data, all of the research shows that from the standpoint of getting the most impact for public resources, time, energy put into neighborhoods. And this is particularly important given that there's so few resources relative to the need available these days, with not much prospect of that changing anytime soon, is all of the data shows that the biggest bang for the buck happens in the neighborhoods that are kind of the struggling ones in the middle, where a relatively small investment can help shift a trajectory from downwards to upwards. And that's all well and good, but that raises a critical question. What about the neighborhoods that are not the struggling areas in the middle, but the neighborhoods which are the truly most deeply distressed neighborhoods? And this, in the final analysis, you can't simply go where the data tells you. You have to use your judgment, you have to use your understanding, and you have to temper your decisions with an awareness of what is fair and what is just and what is going to provide benefits for all members of the community in some fashion. So, in the final analysis, data can tell you a lot and it can give you a lot of good directions. But at the same time, anybody who uses it must be guided as well by a larger sense of equity and social justice. Thank you.
Both from a national perspective, but also locally, providing us data for our own communities. And we now have an opportunity for questions, so please feel free to direct your questions directly to Alan.
Sir. And by the way, please, before, I'm a little hard of hearing, so please, especially if you're near the back, speak up, project.
All right. This thing you keep hearing all the time, the widening gap with the middle income group, that definitely needs to be factored into
That,
I mean, and from what I read recently, our area is one of the worst in the nation.
I haven't looked at the numbers on that for Miami-Dade, and it wouldn't surprise me, but I have actually I'm currently working on a research paper for the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy on specifically that issue but I'm focusing on older industrial cities like St. Louis, Milwaukee, Baltimore, a place like that. And it's a powerful and frightening factor because you have two things going on. As you can see, you've got restarted here. You have two things going on. Number one is what people have called the hollowing of the middle class, generally, which has nothing to do with City X or City Y, but has to do with large national patterns which tend to be pushing people more into either upper or lower income position and reducing the number of people in the middle. And which of course reflects the fact that the number of good jobs in the middle, especially for people who do not have college degrees, has dwindled drastically. So that's the second part, though, and this is the part where it gets into what's happening at the local level, is a process that a colleague of mine has dubbed economic sorting. It's funny, if you go back 40, 50 years, a very large percentage of the population of any city lived in what you might call middle-income neighborhoods. That doesn't mean they were all middle income, but they lived in neighborhoods that had enough of a mix of rich, medium, and poor people, or maybe not quite rich, but people of different income levels, so that the median income of the neighborhood approximated the median income of the city or county as a whole. The number of those neighborhoods has dropped dramatically. In some of the cities, there are perhaps only half as many as there were 30 or 40 years ago. Because what's happened is that people are increasingly sorting by income. Lower income people into lower income areas, upper income people into upper income areas, and there are fewer and fewer neighborhoods in the cities that represent naturally economically integrated communities compared to 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I think both are problems. How we reverse them, I'm not sure. But I think it's important to try to do so through, and I think one way to try to do so is by actively fostering economic integration in neighborhoods where you possibly can, whether through inclusionary housing in more affluent neighborhoods or for trying to create the conditions for middle-class people living in what are currently lower-income neighborhoods. But it is for the combination of the increasing inequality in the income distribution as a whole and the process of economic sorting has created a dramatic change in the underlying dynamics of our communities. Sir.
Don't you think that's physical? I mean, the economic sorting is essentially what the suburbs were made on. I mean, you have a pod that is 200,000, a pod that is 250,000, a pod that is 500,000. And I think it showed, you said you didn't know Miami as well, but if you look at your data there, Kendall, which essentially is our great western suburb, was that area, that outlier that went down further than other areas, but yet has ownership. It was sort of a weird mix.
Right.
And I think,
I think the answer is yes and no. I mean, there's always been, economic sorting. We've never lived in a world where everybody sort of lives side by side, intermingled.
no.
But I think what's interesting is that when you look at the same and historically, especially during the 2 or 3 decades following World War II, the economic sorting had a lot to do with geographic mobility as the suburbs were developed and as the Sun Belt became a center of population and grew population from the North and Midwest. But what's interesting about this, the data that I'm talking about is I'm not talking within a given geographic area, within the same geography, where you're not seeing necessarily a lot of new development happening. You're seeing the people sorting themselves differently within that same area. So I think that's a somewhat different phenomenon than the historic sort of sorting from the suburban growth. Ma'am in the back.
Yes. What part did cultural groups play in the statistical presentation? Were there some cultures considered in this, or this was straight economic without consideration?
I've only looked at sort of straight economic data. But, I mean, it's clear, we are not simply economic actors. We are part of cultural, racial, ethnic, it's all kinds of different subgroups. And clearly, those things play an important role. I think what's interesting, for example, is I noticed even in the 79th Street area, parts of the area are fairly heavily Hispanic. Parts of the area are almost entirely African American. So there are, even within a very small area, there are differences. Within Miami-Dade, I mean, there's lots of different cultures. I mean, even the term Hispanic is a misnomer because there's so many huge differences between people from Nicaragua or people from Cuba or etc. So these are tremendously important factors. I haven't delved into them, but they are tremendously important when you look at these communities. And another thing, just mention that in the United States as a whole, is there are increasing what you might call cultural differences by income, by economic status, that cut across race and ethnicity. There's the cultural patterns of a Cuban ethnic person with a PhD and a job in a large corporation making 5-6 digits are going to be closer, in all likelihood, to the cultural patterns of a similar Anglo than they will be to the cultural patterns of a very low-income, uneducated Cuban ethnic. Well, in the back, and then
Have you done a study of the projection of what amount of affordable housing Miami will need in the next 10 years?
no. I wouldn't even want to guess. That's a complicated question, sir.
Yes, could you talk a little bit more about your approach to rapidly changing neighborhoods? You mentioned the challenges with data and you talked about focus groups. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I think one of the important things, which is a problem with data and a market reality, is a lot of data lags. So for example, it's 2015 today, but the most recent data you can get, for example, on demographics, which is from the American Community Survey, is 2013 data. Actually, it's not really 2013 data either, but that's what it really is a subject for the truly hardcore data wonks. But, so the point is there's a huge lag there. The same is true of the HMDA data, for example, on mortgages, is also, the most recent data available is for 2013. So there's a tremendous, some data is better. Data on real estate transactions and sales is closer to real time. But so that's a basic problem. The second problem, of course, is that no matter, even if you had timely data, it wouldn't tell you everything you want to know. The other side of the coin is that markets are very nimble. Market change can happen very quickly when something gets going. Neighborhoods can, either upward or downward, can, as it were, turn on a dime much faster than 1 or 2 or 3-year-old data can tell you. So what you're looking at is a way to do two things. One is to look behind or beneath the data to get a sense of what's really going on from people's perceptions. The second is to keep track of what's happening most recently and as close as you can to real time. So that's the purpose of this kind of focus group idea, or the purposes. And the idea is basically, it's a very simple thing, is identify, let's say, 10 people who, as far as you know, have their finger on the pulse of the neighborhood as best they can, and get them together on a regular basis, frame a series of questions, maybe show them what the data is saying, ask them to react to it, frame a series of questions. Are you seeing what kind of people are buying? Are more people fixing up their houses? Are new people moving in? What are they like? Are they families? Are they single people? All these kinds of, just to get a sense of what's underneath the data and what's happening currently. And it's not scientific, but it gives you a feeling. And one thing, and again, there's a lot of evidence for this. It's funny, if you ask, it's a classic story, thing about, you take a great big glass bowl and you fill it up with jelly beans, and you ask people to guess how many jelly beans there are. And if you ask one person, odds are she's going to be way off. If you ask 10 people, it's not going to be as far off. If you ask 100 people, it's going to be probably within 5% of the real number. So the more people you ask the same questions, and you sort of integrate the information you get from them, the better the information is. Yes, sir?
The slides with the maps of the wide swath in the center where the investor sales are happening. I wonder if you have any thoughts from other places that you've worked. What is the trajectory of that longer term, medium to long term? Is that properties that are going to be held onto and rented? Are they going to be eventually flipped? Is that a big transformation coming, or I don't know if you have
Again, it's complicated because you really have to look at what are the underlying market dynamics. Clearly, Miami is unusual in that respect because of a couple of things. First, there's a strong seasonal component to the market in Miami that, for example, there's in Buffalo, for rather obvious reasons, there's not much in the way of a seasonal market. You don't see people saying, I think I'll winter in Buffalo, summer in Miami or something. No. So there's a strong seasonal component. There's also a strong dynamic in that Miami has, for many years, and will probably continue to be so, been a major investment opportunity, seen as an investment opportunity for large numbers of overseas investors, particularly from Latin America. And again, it's not unique. There are sort of a handful. Las Vegas, for example, is another city that has a lot of very similar market dynamics to Miami, even though in that case, the investors are more likely to be Asian than Latin American, but their money is pretty much the same thing. So those tend to throw it off and make it kind of hard to predict exactly what. But I think if you look at areas, and again, particularly the northern neighborhoods, these are areas where you're not going to see much impact from investors. Obviously, there's certain investors, yes, but we're not the big investors, high-end investors. And these are neighborhoods that, for the most part, do not have a large seasonal component in their housing stock. So and I think, if we look at this, this is not atypical. It's an area where, at this point, it's very profitable for investors to rent. And the rents to the sales are high enough so that people can easily be motivated to try to maximize their profit and cut corners on maintenance and cut corners on care in terms of who they rent to and things of that sort. So I think there is a serious risk that unless people think very seriously about coming up with some strategies to better raise the bar for absentee ownership, that those could be heading into a serious downward trajectory. If you start to get a big increase in absentee ownership and an increase in irresponsible absentee ownership in terms of low maintenance and low selection criteria for tenants and so forth, then you could really be seeing some serious downward pressures in those areas. So I think, personally, the issue of coming up with an effective, and this is something that clearly requires the county to develop some ordinances and programs and put them into place. It's not something that a nonprofit or a CDC can do on its own. To have some really good standards of what standards landlords have to meet, have good inspection programs, also offer incentives for responsible landlord behavior. All of these things are, I think, really important policies to help. Not only, they do two things. One is they might make life better for tenants, because tenants shouldn't be living in houses that don't meet minimum health and safety standards, period. And secondly, they help stabilize neighborhoods. Sir?
Alan, can you talk about how the reversal of economic sorting can impact neighborhoods? What does that do, or what has economic sorting caused?
Well, I think there's a lot of research and as well as a lot of just plain flat out experience that increased poverty concentrations are basically bad. Neighborhoods, and I would extend it, poverty, what is defined as poverty is a very low number. But even low income can be a problem. I think what happens when a neighborhood becomes essentially a low-income neighborhood and a high-poverty neighborhood, it triggers a lot of problems. From a market standpoint, what it does is that it tends to become a kind of a vicious spiral. If people who, and it goes back to some basic consumer choice issues, if people who have enough money to choose between neighborhoods stop choosing a particular neighborhood, what that means is that the only people who will end up living in that neighborhood are people who don't have enough money to have any other choices. And that means, in turn, that with the exception of a few people who may, have strong roots in that neighborhood or are committed to it for some reason or another, what it means is for the great majority of people in that neighborhood, what they're thinking is, gosh, if I get a raise, or if I can ever get my associate's degree and get a decent job and so forth, I'm out of here. And so that dynamic is, to my mind, and I believe this, and I've gotten into arguments with CDC people and so forth who think I'm stigmatizing people in low-income neighborhoods, which I'm not. But I've never seen an example, a counterexample. When you create that dynamic, you're creating, a downward spiral. And I think that's the biggest harm of the economic sorting process, is that it's creating more and more neighborhoods that are basically on a downward spiral. It's also creating some neighborhoods, not as many, but some neighborhoods that are prospering beyond what their wildest dreams might have been only a few years ago. Some of those is what we call gentrifying neighborhoods. But there are a lot more that are going down than are going up.
Alan.
Sir. Oh, sorry.
Have you recently or even in the past run into any data showing a revitalization based on job creation? Have you seen any success with that? Because the economy, there's lots of new jobs, but we're all looking at jobs.
It depends. The answer, certainly, job creation helps people. Job creation, if people can get good jobs, people can get jobs at a decent wage, that helps people. The issue of whether it helps neighborhoods is more complicated, because the question is, what do people do when they get the better jobs and the better wages?
Okay, well, I think my point was that if you bring jobs into these neighborhoods that need everything, and the improvement starts, people start taking better care, they can buy a house, they can be the investors.
I have not.
You got any data to support any of that?
No, because, and I don't know if it would work that way. I mean, I think it's because typically, most people don't work in the neighborhood where they live, and most jobs, and this is the key thing, and there's a lot of data behind this, the point I'm going to make, is that no matter where the jobs are, in most cases, the people who hold those jobs live all over the place. So creating an environment, if you bring jobs in, let's say you have a neighborhood, and you get some kind of a significant job generating facility, whether it's manufacturing or distribution or shopping center, the people who are going to hold those jobs, unless you you can't simply say, I believe, we're not going to hire anybody for these jobs who doesn't live in the neighborhood. that you can try to provide access, you can try to provide information, so forth. But in the end, people work all over the place and live all over the place. And there's no consistency between where the jobs are and where the people live. So I'm not sure that bringing jobs into a neighborhood, if those jobs don't translate directly into services and things. Now, if you bring certain types of jobs and certain types of businesses into a neighborhood that really represent improved services for the people who live in the neighborhood, that could be different. But I'm not at all certain that bringing jobs into a neighborhood in the sense of just facilities that have jobs but don't otherwise have neighborhood impacts are likely to have a significant change effect on the neighborhood. I'd be interested in seeing examples to the contrary, but I haven't seen data on it, at least. Oh, sir.
I want to go back to what you said just before this last thing. And this also goes with homeownership versus renters. How do you develop a strategy without stigmatizing low-income people or stigmatizing renters as a polarizing the situation where it's homeowners versus renters, or renters are the problem, or poor people are the problem in a neighborhood?
I think it's difficult. Because poor people are not a problem. Poverty is a problem. And I think somehow it's, it's important to make that distinction. And I think the other point is that it's important to recognize that, and people have been pointing this out, my God, for 40, 50 years, that the concentration of poverty creates a series of effects that are a problem. It's not a question of individual poor people. And I think it's incredibly important to keep these distinctions clear, to avoid stigmatizing people. The same thing is, I think there's a real problem on the homeownership rental issue as well. The fact is, and I can cite enough research that if I laid them on the floor, they would reach close to the ceiling, that shows the positive effects of homeownership, even when you control for economic status, on neighborhoods, on child outcomes, on property maintenance, on et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is no, to my mind, there is no significant doubt about that. But that does not mean that everybody should become a homeownership or ever will become a homeowner. And it does not mean that rental housing does not play a critically important part in terms of the housing stock and enabling people to live decently. So the issue, and again, making this clear and keeping these points clear is difficult, is what you're trying to achieve in a neighborhood is a high level of homeownership, not 100% homeownership. You're trying to create, if nationally, about 2/3 of the American households are homeowners, about 1/3 are renters. If one could have a mix like that in a neighborhood, that's probably not a bad thing. And the issue then, because it's not that tenants are bad, but landlords, and it's not that landlords are bad, but and I think this is the point, landlords who abuse the responsibilities of property ownership and who do not maintain their properties and pay their taxes and pay proper attention to the tenants they select and so forth are a problem. But landlords who are responsible, maintain their properties and pay their taxes are as much a neighborhood asset as anybody else. So I think it is critically important as you talk about these issues and as you try to plan in a neighborhood to kind of walk that tightrope between, on the one hand, recognizing difficult realities, but avoiding stigmatizing people. Sir, I don't know if we have time for any more after this gentleman.
Maybe one more after.
Okay, so I didn't get the first part of your presentation, and I'm sorry. But given the best part. Given the data that you looked at, you seem to separate, at least in my mind, neighborhoods that have external issues and neighborhoods that have internal ones. And most neighborhoods have both, or some sort of mix. Did you discuss the whole issue of mixed income housing? Because that can be a very sensitive problem when you have neighborhoods that are suffering from these all sorts of internal problems like high crime and those things. Because the first thing that people tend to see is something on the order of gentrification, those kinds of things. In other words, I'm asking, can mixed income, to the extent that it does not displace people that are there, but acts as an infill kind of strategy, can that still be effective?
I think it can. I think, again, it's difficult. And I think the issue of, I think you have to look at the dynamics of the neighborhood, the housing stock, a lot of other things. Certainly, the best thing is to try to create neighborhoods that are economically integrated, that are not simply in transition from being all poor to all wealthy. But the interesting thing is, gentrification. I mean, this is one heck of a complicated issue that we could spend the next couple of hours talking about. But outside of areas that have incredibly hot markets and demand, like, for example, the Washington, D.C. area or the San Francisco area, the actual incidence of neighborhoods which gentrify in the sense that they go from being predominantly poor to overwhelmingly well-to-do, and the poor people basically disappear, is tiny. Those things exist more in urban mythology than reality. In fact, a good friend of mine who studied the St. Louis metro area has been looking at this closely, and he has yet to find a neighborhood in the entire St. Louis metropolitan area that has gone from being predominantly poor to having virtually no poor people over the last 40, 50 years. They simply, and that's not the worst metro from an economic standpoint in the country by far. So I think, now certainly there are always exceptions. If you have a neighborhood that happens to be extremely well situated in terms of convenience, say, to a major university or major transit line, or a neighborhood that has unusually distinctive houses that, are likely to draw particular attention from people who have the money to fix them up, then you have to be more careful. But I think the risk, especially when we're looking at most of the northern part of Miami-Dade, is not of that kind of dramatic flip, if you will, is not great. But I think at the same time, you have to make sure that you don't want to see people actually literally being displaced. To the extent that you can use infill, and a lot of these areas do have quite a bit of vacant land, quite a bit of underutilized land. There may be opportunities to create, major change in terms of additional housing units and other things where you can create more of a mixed income environment. So I think it's definitely worth pursuing. I'm not going to totally poo-poo the fears of gentrification, but I do think they're often blown out of proportion. Yes.
There was one more question over here.
Yes, sir.
Just sort of answered it. Being a product of the 79th Street corridor, my parents who lived there, I was just trying to see what we kind of said the economic integration would be more of a change that we could see that would improve the lifestyle, improve the neighborhood. That was my question. What other factors play a part? I know we talked about education and we talked about, the social economic standpoint, but what are the things that you see could play a part in improving the quality of life of getting individuals to, sort of stay in those areas?
Okay, I think that's a huge question, and I'll start out by saying I don't know enough about the area to have an intelligent answer. But I think some of the things, and it shouldn't be an either or. I mean, clearly, a major thing is to improve the education level, the skills, the employment, the employability, and the opportunity for people who live in the neighborhood. But again, the trick there is to do it at the same time as you're improving the neighborhood to the point where somebody who lives there and who does get their degree and does get a better job doesn't say, I'm out of here. So it's the trick is to find the balance and somehow to make the neighborhood a more desirable place to live. So trying to think of things, whether it's, it could be new housing, it could be improving existing housing, it could be things like improving curb appeal. It's interesting, you go back. This is, what's interesting, this part of the neighborhood looks a lot better than this part of the neighborhood. And why does it look better? The houses are better maintained, but also you've got these nice sidewalks, you've got fencing, you've got landscaping, so sometimes just a little thing like that can make a big difference. And in fact, that also makes a big difference when people start looking at a neighborhood in terms of, do I want to buy a house here? Because somebody might drive down this street and say, well, maybe I would. Drive down this street and say, no way. So all of these things, you've got to tie it together. But I think the key thing is somehow to find that balance between making the neighborhood a more appealing place to live while improving the economic conditions for the people who live there. And attracting, trying to, whether it would be realistic in the short run to attract middle-income home buyers to an area like that is a question in my mind, or whether you have to start working on some of these other factors first. And that's where it goes back to the internal versus external kind of strategy issue. But again, I don't know enough about that neighborhood to say, really.
Well, please join me again in thanking Alan Mallach.